Balmoral. The royal family's
set about making Birkhall
before. They didn't fully.
Balmoral. The royal family's majestic 50,000-acre Scottish estate. The centre of their yearly pilgrimage to the Highlands. But what most people don't know is that there's another royal retreat hidden deep in these forests just down the road. A secret sanctuary King Charles has kept just for himself.
It's completely secluded. It's away from everybody, away from everything.
It's really hidden. It's very, very private.
It's the place King Charles proposed to his beloved Camilla, and the property that means most to them in the world. This is Birkhall.
I think when they land at Birkhall, it's a case of really, whew, here we are.
But this little Scottish lodge isn't just a luxurious love nest. Surprisingly, it's been at the centre of some of the most explosive moments of royal history. From life-altering encounters...
That meeting at Birkhall is very significant.
The Queen Mother never invited him back again.
...to the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage.
He was photographed leaving Birkhall with Camilla. That was the scandal.
But ruling a nation comes with difficult decisions. And as pressure on Charles grows to downsize his large property portfolio, will he have to put his cherished woodland lodge up for sale?
The future for Birkhall is a question mark.
I don't know what's going to happen.
And say goodbye to over 6 generations of royal memories.
Princess Elizabeth especially would cry when she had to go home because she said that Birkhall was the nicest place in the world.
Now we reveal the secrets of this much-loved royal hideaway.
Three cheers for His Majesty, the King! Hep, hep!
On the 6th of May 2023, at the grand age of 74, Charles III was crowned king. But his first years of leadership have not been easy.
Monarchy is not without its challenges, and of course, for Charles, there's been a number of challenges.
The family difficulties with Prince Andrew. Then came the diagnosis of cancer, not only for the king, but for the Princess of Wales.
And there have been financial pressures too.
The cost of living crisis, that has been something that's loomed over his reign and still is today.
Across the nation, his loyal subjects have been struggling to make ends meet. And even King Charles himself has been feeling the pinch. On paper, he's one of the richest monarchs in Europe, estimated to be worth £1.8 billion. But in reality, the monarch's finances are a lot more complicated.
He's wealthy, he's rich, of course he is, but these figures that are bandied about are ridiculous because the royal collection, the palaces, most of them belong to the nation, they belong to the crown.
Yet the cost of maintaining all those assets falls squarely at Charles's door. Between 2023 and 2024, the royal family's outgoings were a whopping £90 million. That included £47 million on the maintenance of his large property portfolio, £27.9 million on the wages of over 1,000 members of staff, and £2.6 million on housekeeping. So Charles has been forced to tighten the palace's purse strings.
Charles has always been quite a cost cutter. He definitely has his eye on the bottom line.
He is aware that the monarchy does have to be accountable, and he's making some inroads into that.
Certainly when he became king, he slashed the cost of monarchy by 80 million. Part of the way he achieved that was by turning the thermostat down at Buckingham Palace just by a couple of degrees. I mean, he is the climate change king after all.
You know, he sold off some of Queen Elizabeth II's racehorses, which raised £2.3 million, not as many royal events.
He's even let go of his house in Wales. But what's next? Could his favourite private retreat in Scotland be on the chopping block too? Birkhall sits deep within the Balmoral estate, just 6 miles from the firm's beloved castle. It's been a place for the royals to escape to for decades.
It's an 18th century stone farmhouse set in the shadow of the mountain Loch Nagar.
It's right in a dip. It must be in a sort of frost hollow because the drive goes right down and it's really hidden. It's very, very private.
It's kind of cosy looking, but very elegant at the same time.
It has a wonderful feeling and a marvellous natural energy and clear air, and you could probably see the stars.
At just 3 floors, it's small for a royal palace. More beloved family home than regal royal residence.
The interiors of Burke Hall are graceful, they're elegant, but there is a touch of, the comfortable country house setting.
There's lots of communal spaces, a lovely dining room, a drawing room, which is sort of intimate, but still quite big.
But it's the gorgeous grounds that are closest to King Charles's heart. Here, he's able to reveal his true self.
The gardens at Burke Hall are stunning, actually, and I think Charles has put his own mark on them very, very clearly.
The house is set in woodlands with a view out over the terraces, so the top terrace is lawn.
And then right at the bottom, we've got what's just called the bell garden because it's in the shape of a bell, and it's primarily a vegetable garden.
So very evocative, very much a peaceful, secluded, happy place.
Charles has even made friends with the local wildlife.
King Charles has this lovely relationship with red squirrels up in Scotland, especially at Burke Hall. According to Prince William, he's actually named them because he knows all of their traits.
There's lovely stories of how Charles allows these red squirrels to come right in to the property and jump around in the drawing room and dining room.
Perhaps it's no surprise this home has such a special place in King Charles's heart. It's central to his relationship with his beloved Camilla.
It's where Charles proposed to Camilla. They went there on their honeymoon.
I think it's one of his favourite places to be, with Camilla sort of curled up on a settee. Well, I don't know, probably she curls up, he probably doesn't curl up. With a glass of whiskey by a log fire, it's lovely.
It's probably the house that they most regard as their home.
And they're not the only members of the monarchy to have been captivated by this romantic retreat.
Quite a few newlyweds have chosen to spend their time at Burke Hall. I mean, the late Queen and Philip went to Burke Hall for their honeymoon.
The Duke of Kent spent his honeymoon there at Burke Hall.
The Count and Countess of Wessex, now the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh.
It became known as the sort of honeymoon home.
So, how did this little corner of Scotland become such a well-loved royal haven? And why was it once a scene of drama for the Queen Mother? With stately homes from Sandringham to Buckingham Palace and castles from Windsor to May, King Charles is a man with the keys to an extraordinary property portfolio. But time and again, him and Camilla return to the little Scottish croft of Burke Hall, set deep in the woodland on the outskirts of the Balmoral estate.
Charles loves it there. Burke Hall is definitely his favourite home.
I suppose it's something to do with the big wide open skies and the freedom that kind of gives you an idea of. Freedom they don't have in their own lives.
The royal connection to this Highland home stretches back to the mid-19th century. But the origins of the property itself lie over 100 years earlier.
Burke Hall was built in 1715 by Captain Charles Gordon of Abergeldy and his wife Rachel.
It's built using local stone. It's a relatively simple design. The original owners call it Burkharr after the birch trees that surround it.
It was a much more modest dwelling than the Birk Hall Charles and Camilla love today, but the little Scottish lodge quickly became a comfortable, secluded family home. Until 1848, when Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, took on the lease of the nearby Balmoral estate and began the royal family's love affair with the Highlands.
Albert was particularly struck by the natural scenery, these towering, rugged cliffs, the wild heath, where they could lose themselves.
He loves exploring the countryside, and one of the places he comes across during his walks is Birk Hall.
Albert was taken with a secluded Highland house immediately. He thought Birk Hall would make the perfect country retreat for his eldest son, the heir to the throne, Prince Edward.
It's a sweet idea that it was for the Prince of Wales, but it was never going to be good enough for him.
He thought it was a dark, small, poky house, and he was miserable.
He stays there once, decides he doesn't like it, it's not for him.
Victoria and Albert, on the other hand, loved it. They threw themselves into making it a property fit for their friends and family.
That dramatic front porch in Birk Hall was installed so that Victoria could get in and out of her carriage without getting wet. The decorations inside, very much like Balmoral.
There was lots of Edwardian photographs on the walls, also Highland scenes done by Sir Edwin Landseer, and so absolutely beautiful.
Birk Hall became a Victorian Airbnb, let out to whoever was currently highest in the Queen's favour. But everything was about to change for this little Scottish lodge. In the 1930s, the York family arrived. The future King George VI, the future Queen Mother, and the young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret. And Birk Hall immediately became the heart of their annual Scottish summer vacation.
Both Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret loved Birk Hall.
They're able to cycle into the local village. The Queen Mother will sometimes take them in to buy some sweets at the local shop.
They would play rather sweet, simple games. They would pretend to be horses.
Princess Elizabeth especially would cry when she had to go home because she said that Birk Hall was the nicest place in the world.
For several years, the York family's summers revolved around Birk Hall. However, in 1936, George became king, and everything changed. The family moved up the road to Balmoral, and their beloved Birk Hall was left empty. But not for long. Just 3 years later, war erupted over Europe.
The sheer scale with which the Luftwaffe were able to attack Britain with aerial bombings shocked and horrified many in the country.
So the government launched Operation Pied Piper, and that was basically to remove children who were in harm's way.
Including the young princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. You know, as the Queen once put it, they need to go somewhere where they don't have to constantly look up at the sky and worry about the next wave of bombings.
So in September 1939, 13-year-old Elizabeth and 9-year-old Margaret were sent back to Birk Hall.
They were nervous about leaving their parents, but it was something that they found quite thrilling.
And came to spend 4 very happy months in Birk Hall, which is much longer than their usual summer vacation.
For the princesses, the big change, however, was that this was a Birk Hall they'd never really seen before. They didn't fully appreciate how cold Birk Hall got in the winter.
Sometimes it was so cold overnight in Scotland that they would find they would wake up and their water basins, the water would be frozen in them.
They sheltered at Birk Hall until Christmas 1939, when the young princesses were moved again, first to Sandringham and then to Windsor. In 1945, the war finally ended. But just as the skies became safe once more, another shadow was gathering on the horizon, and Birk Hall would once again find itself at the heart of the drama.
George VI was a sick man for many years. But when he died, it was the most enormous shock, particularly to his loving wife, the Queen.
She was very young, a very young widow, and she hadn't just lost her beloved husband. She'd lost everything. She'd lost her homes, she'd lost her job, she'd lost her role, and she'd lost her status, really. So she was absolutely bereft.
In one letter to a friend, the Queen Mother writes that grief batters you about until you almost don't know who you are anymore. She is considering permanently retiring to Scotland and stepping back from public duties.
She retreated to Birk Hall to mourn alone. But luckily, there was help around the corner from a rather unexpected source. In October 1952, Winston Churchill drove over to Birk Hall to speak to the Queen Mother in private.
Obviously, no one knows what went on in that conversation, but people said afterwards she seemed different, and she seemed more resolute, and she seemed to kind of got her mojo back.
That meeting at Birk Hall is very significant, and actually we got another 50 years of public service out of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother.
The Queen Mother was filled with a new sense of purpose. And first things first, she wanted a renovation for her new Scottish home.
The Queen Mother set about making Birk Hall very much her own.
She wanted to make this a home from home, and she loved having people to stay.
So she had a whole new wing put onto the house, which her daughter, the Queen, financed. And it had 4 new bedrooms and bathrooms. And I think most important, it had enormous French windows opening up onto the gardens. Because the Queen Mother was all about fresh air, you know, let that lovely Scottish breeze blow in.
She didn't rely on an expensive or exciting designer to help, but instead embraced her own unique style.
The Queen Mother's taste in interior decorating, and indeed in most things, was sort of 1 part Scottish tradition, 2 parts chintz, and then throw in a bit of whimsy for whatever had taken her fancy that day.
Simultaneously, she was renovating her other Scottish Highland retreat, the Castle of May. Here you can see the same style she'll have brought to Birk Hall.
Anywhere she could put time, she would. And also, she loved having things. So there was always trinkets on every surface, tables, side tables. She just couldn't have a blank surface.
If she wanted cream sofas and 4 different kinds of tartan in one room, then she would have it. And she very much did at Birk Hall.
It's old-fashioned, yes, elegant, but cosy. And I think that's the most important thing.
It's the personality of the Queen Mother herself, transformed into interior design. But she did bring one unique feature exclusively to Birk Hall.
The Queen Mother obviously liked clocks because there were 8 chiming carriage or grandfather clocks within the dining room. But they all chimed at slightly different times.
This apparently used to send her guests crazy because you'd just get into a conversation and they'd go ding, 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 all over the place. So, but I think she thoroughly enjoyed her guests' discomfort.
She was helped with the renovation by her treasurer, Sir Arthur Penn. But after months of work at Birk Hall, they realised they'd missed something important.
They realised that they'd forgotten to put a toilet in the downstairs of this huge house.
So one was sort of subsequently fitted under the stairs. And the Queen Mother thought this was so hilarious that she wanted to do an official opening of the water closet, which I absolutely loved.
So the room was filled with flowers, and the Queen Mother pulled the chain, and she said, "I declare this room Arthur's Seat." And Arthur's Seat, of course, is a mountain in Scotland, but Arthur Penn had come up with the design.
By the mid-1950s, Birk Hall was ready to provide the main stop on the Queen Mother's annual Scottish tour.
Come the summer, come August, she'd head up north and she'd go first of all to the Castle of May. She'd spend a couple of weeks there and then move down and spend about 6 weeks of the summer at Burke Hall.
She would travel from the airport in a limo, and her entourage of 20 staff or so, who were all sort of been with her for years and years, so they travelled with her. They were behind in a coach.
So you would have this slightly surreal spectacle of a car carrying the Queen Mother and her guest, or sometimes her daughter, and behind it would be following the Queen Mother's rented bus.
But once her vast entourage was finally settled into Burke Hall, the Queen Mother was able to throw herself into country living with gusto.
The Queen Mother really thought that there was nothing better than these weeks at Burke Hall. She loved it.
She loved being outdoors, so she would spend a lot of her time fishing, walking through the River Muick.
She was a great fly fisherwoman. I mean, right up into her 80s.
How would you rate her? If you had to sum her up as a fisher, how would you rate her?
Oh, excellent. One of the best lady fishers I have here. In fact, the best.
One guest said, you know, she'd come in, it was after dark, and presented the assembled guests with a £20 salmon. She was triumphant about it.
And after a day in the wide outdoors, the evenings at Burke Hall were reserved for even more merriment.
There was a lot of drinking, a lot of party games.
I've always heard, all the years I've reported on the royal family, about Racing Demon, which is a card game they've all loved, and it's extremely competitive. And the Queen Mother did like to win.
Most of the Queen Mother's guests understood this unwritten rule, until it came to her neighbour, the Duke of Athol.
He decided, you know, I'm really going to go for this. And when it seemed that the Queen Mother had won, and he knew that actually he'd won, he demanded a recount. And then she lost, and she never invited him back again.
An invitation to Burke Hall was hard to come by anyway, only extended to the Queen Mother's nearest and dearest. Most importantly, it was where she built a strong bond with the young Prince Charles.
For Charles, she was this haven of security and affection and laughter and love. When he was at Gordonstoun, which he didn't really enjoy, the school in the north of Scotland, he would, whenever he could, take the 2-hour journey to Burke Hall to be with his beloved granny.
She taught him about the finer things of life: opera, music, painting, drawing. Once he even dreamt that he ran away from Gordonstoun to join Granny.
He loved the little Scottish lodge as much as she did, and that got him special treatment.
At Burke Hall, King George VI's bedroom was on the ground floor, and it was kept as he'd left it. And the only person that was ever allowed to sleep in there was Prince Charles, and that was a special honour given to him by his grandmother.
As he grew older, Burke Hall played a part in the next stage of Charles's life too. In 1977, Charles met Diana Spencer. And in 1980, he took her to Balmoral to see the Queen, and to Burke Hall to meet his grandmother.
At that time, if I'm led to believe it to be true, I think she sort of rather liked it.
Charles was delighted, and certainly that did continue after they were married and had their 2 sons, William and Harry.
For a young family, trips to Scotland offered the perfect summer escape.
The boys loved it. I mean, it was a great wilderness where they could run free.
This was a swallows and Amazons playground of giant proportions that they were fortunate enough to be in. Even now they talk about, you know, their joyful childhood.
But by the late 80s, Charles and Diana's marriage was on the rocks. And as their relationship began to unravel, so did their time at Balmoral and their trips to Burke Hall.
Anything to do with the summer holidays in Balmoral would have been an absolute anathema to Diana, to have to sit through the pain and agony pretending that all is well, when actually things weren't that well.
So while she stayed down in London, Charles went off and just sort of Stayed away from the cameras as much as possible in Scotland.
But perhaps there was another reason Diana stopped wanting to visit Birk Hall. The little Scottish lodge was about to find itself at the centre of a serious scandal.
The photographer got a picture of a certain Camilla Parker Bowles coming out of Birk Hall with the then Prince Charles, which caused somewhat of a frenzy.
By the early 90s, Birk Hall had firmly established itself as a special place for the Queen Mother and her favourite grandson, Prince Charles. But the little Highland Lodge was hiding a huge secret.
In 1990, Charles had an accident playing polo.
The Prince of Wales cancelled most of his engagements last month because of severe back pain.
Ultimately, this led to him spending a period of recovery at Birk Hall.
He went on his own, leaving Diana and William and Harry at Kensington Palace, and he spent 2 months up at Birk Hall.
That September, scandal struck.
Charles was photographed leaving Birk Hall with Camilla.
It's difficult to think of it now, of course, because we have King Charles and Queen Camilla, but it was huge. I think it was the first time that they had been pictured together.
It wasn't something that was new to Diana. I think what this did was cement exactly what her fears were, that this relationship had continued through her entire marriage.
The fact that she was there, effectively living with him, and there was proof of this, kind of blew the affair really right out into the open.
Diana had had enough. In December 1992, they separated, and in 1996, officially divorced.
Once again, it was to Birk Hall that Charles went to seek refuge. I think it's really interesting that Birk Hall plays such an important role for Charles in these pivotal moments in his life. He finds solace in the environment, in the grounds, in the outdoors, and he can really kind of be at one with both nature and his kind of innermost thoughts.
For half a century, Birk Hall had been his grandmother's haven. But her visit in 2001 would be her last. On the 30th of March 2002, she passed away at her Windsor home, Royal Lodge, aged 101.
She was such a grand old lady and so very loved. But nevertheless, I think that everyone was surprised when the crowds outside the lying in state at Westminster Abbey got longer and longer.
By mid-afternoon, the queue to see the coffin stretched over a mile.
Many people went to sign the Book of Condolences. Nearly 250,000 people filed past her coffin as it lay in state.
I myself went in about 2 in the morning. And so I think it was just an outpouring love for a very, very grand old lady who'd been there all our lives and who many people had come to love.
But her death hit one person most of all.
For Charles, the loss of his grandmother was absolutely devastating. I remember so clearly him walking behind her coffin. You could feel the tears that were trying to come out of his eyes.
Just as the Queen Mother had wanted, after her death, Birk Hall passed to Charles. But it was a home stuck in a time warp. It felt like it did when she moved in the 1950s.
It did need some updating. The heating and the plumbing especially was a little bit run down.
Charles doesn't do anything by halves, and so he set about refurbishing it.
But he didn't have to do it alone. By the time the Queen Mother died, Charles and Camilla's relationship was out in the open, and she was heavily involved with the remodel of Birk Hall.
Charles and Camilla were certainly trying to put both of their stamp on this home. This is probably the closest thing to a marital home that they will ever have.
Birk Hall is too private a residence for it to be easy to see inside. But you can get a real sense of what it may be like from Clarence House, Charles's home in London, where he used the same interior designer, Robert Keim.
Robert Kine's style was quite traditional, so lots of antique furniture, things like that. But also he brought in some Middle Eastern influences as well, rugs and furniture from that part of the world, so fused the two things together.
Most importantly, Charles and Camilla have preserved the memory of his beloved grandmother.
He kept the Queen Mother's barometer hanging up that guests used to check what the weather was like before they went outside. And her coats are still hanging up on a hook by the door as well, which is really sweet.
So it's a timepiece to his grandmother, but it's modernised and incredibly comfortable. I think the interior designer found it a bit frustrating that he said, we've really got to replace these curtains. And so Charles was saying, yes, absolutely, but I want them to be exactly the same pattern. So he'd have to do that. But he spruced it up and made it a bit more modern.
There's just one change Charles has made that his grandmother might frown upon.
He kept those 8 grandfather clocks in the dining room, but he set them all to the same time, so it didn't drive everybody as bonkers as it had done before.
Almost immediately after the works were finished, Birk Hall became a special place for Charles and Camilla. Whenever possible, they make the 500-mile journey north from London to their remote little lodge. It's a chance to really escape. The closest town is Ballater, and that's home to less than 2,000 people.
I think when they land at Birk Hall, it's a case of really, whew, here we are. We're going to enjoy one another's company, and we're going to walk, and we're going to sit, and we're going to read, and we're going to have a little drink, and we're going to just be together. And I think it is one of their very favourite places to be.
I think he likes that whole idea that even though the rest of the family might be at Balmoral, he could still escape to somewhere like Birk Hall and just have that wonderful space for him and Camilla.
In 2005, Camilla even revealed that Charles had proposed at Birk Hall.
Camilla sported a whopping diamond upon her finger, and she was clearly on a high.
I'm just coming down to earth.
Now, we don't know whether Charles went down on one knee, but he is a very traditional man, so I would expect that he may have done, he was a bit younger then, 20 years ago, so he proposed to Camilla and asked her to marry him, and she said, of course, why would I not say anything else?
And just a few months later, following what by now seems to be family tradition, Birk Hall is also where they spent their honeymoon.
It's a perfect place to have lots of romantic walks around the grounds, candlelit dinners, roaring fires. It's a place where they can really, really relax.
They are romantic, and he's always looking for little ways to make her happy. He'll pick some lovely flowers from the garden at Birk Hall and put them on her desk where she works, or he'll put something, by her bed, in her bedroom, little posy of flowers that he thinks she might like. Yeah, they are still very sweet.
But the UK was about to face another crisis. And Birk Hall would once again find itself in the role of royal protector. In 2020, the coronavirus pandemic took hold of the world, and Charles tested positive.
It was pretty devastating to hear that Charles had COVID. This was the very start of the pandemic. We'd had all sorts of warnings. Lockdown was just beginning. It was scary times.
I mean, there were real fears within the royal family and the establishment that Charles was going to die.
It was fortunate for Charles and Camilla that when he was diagnosed with COVID, they were up at Birk Hall. So if you've got to quarantine somewhere, be in your favourite home.
Luckily, the then Prince of Wales was okay. And the pandemic actually gave the public a surprising insight into what it's like inside Birk Hall.
Like everybody else at that time, once Charles had recovered, he was doing much of his work through video calls.
The creation of his hospital is the result of an extraordinary partnership, create a centre on a scale that has never been seen before.
And Camilla was doing that as well, so it gave us a bit of a sneak peek into what Birk Hall looked like.
We saw Camilla sitting at her desk, and it seems her study is quite light and airy and bright with, the fresh flowers and bookcase behind her. Charles is a little more businesslike, perhaps, but delightfully cluttered, I suppose, with photographs everywhere of the family and books.
Charles's real labour of love at the property, however, has always been the gardens. And it's easy to see why. Building on the work started by his beloved grandmother, Charles has poured his heart into enhancing and expanding this stunning space.
The colour palette has quietened down a bit from Queen Mother's more flowery style, but it's very much a sort of Scottish garden, benefiting from the mist and the rain.
The topiary was carved into the two ciphers of the Queen, Elizabeth Regina, with CP, Prince Charles, Charles Princeps. And I think that's actually rather charming, actually, that he had his sort of topiary cipher alongside his mother's.
I think it's lovely to just know that, King Charles will walk around with his little black book of knowing where, which plant's gone in where, the selection of heirloom vegetables that he's chosen. And some of those will probably be plants that the Queen Mother would have grown as well, because it then still has that lovely story and those memories, which is really important for him.
And Charles has thrown himself into making the grounds as sustainable and environmentally friendly as possible.
Everything is done on organic principles, so no pesticides, no herbicides. It's all done with fresh and manure, which of course might be a little bit stinky at times, but it's the best way of doing organic gardening.
And of course, the vegetable gardens are very important to him, and they grow all sorts of food that they're going to eat. And if it doesn't come from Birk Hall, then it's probably going to come from Highgrove, because Charles does like his properly sourced and organic food.
He's come up with a novel way of managing the pests too. In 2005, Charles introduced 7 Indian runner ducks like these to the Birk Hall garden.
They run around and they just eat up all the things like slugs, all the nasty pests as well that might be on leaves. And I just think it's beautiful. I think it's a lovely, playful way of introducing sort of fun into a garden.
For 20 years, Birk Hall was Charles and Camilla's romantic Scottish hideaway, perfectly designed for their every need. But in 2022, everything changed. Queen Elizabeth II died, leaving the throne and some very difficult decisions about the future of Birk Hall to her eldest son.
His deep love for the Birk Hall connection and what he has done to that over many, many years of his life would be something tragic, really, for him to release that or give it up.
I don't know what's going to happen to Birk Hall.
For over 150 years, Birk Hall has provided a secluded Scottish retreat for some of the most distinguished members of the royal family. And it has a special place in the heart of a new generation of royals too.
I think William and Catherine enjoy their time in Scotland as well, and Birk Hall is very much part of their life up there.
William apparently spoke to Kate's father and asked his permission to marry Kate on a weekend visit in Birk Hall. And he asked him before he asked Charles.
As their family's grown, they've shared their love of the Scottish Lodge with their children too. And Charles has worked hard to make Birk Hall fun for his grandkids.
He's always said that. It's this whole idea of bringing that family tradition going through. So there's a bouncy bridge, and he says, you've just got to bounce on this bridge because it's so much fun. There are small strawberries that kids can pick at the side of pathways. And he just always hopes that, when Prince George has grown up, he too will love the trees and love Birk Hall.
But there's one particularly special area George, Charlotte and Louis always head to as soon as they arrive.
There is a little Wendy house.
And it's really cute. It's so beautiful. It's got this thatched roof, and it's thatched with heather. The walls are covered in bark. It looks like it should be a fairy in there or a gnome living at the end of your garden.
It was installed in 1935 for Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret and has stood in the Birk Hall grounds for nearly 100 years.
Just to think that Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret used to play there, have a wonderful time there, and now all the rest of the grandchildren can continue to play in the garden, I think is a wonderful thing.
But in 2022, tragedy hit the Highland estate. And Burke Hall played centre stage. At 96, and after 70 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II fell seriously ill at Balmoral.
Charles had been summoned to Balmoral on the morning of his mother's death, and he was told that it'd probably be a few hours before she passed away.
Charles and Anne took it in turns to sit with the Queen, and then I think as she slipped into a coma, Charles needed a bit of fresh air and some nature, so he went to the grounds of Burke Hall, and it was there that he took the call.
He knew what had happened because he was addressed by the person who rang him, the courtier, as Your Majesty. And then he knew, well, my mother has died, and obviously he raced back to Balmoral to be at her side.
Her death left a nation and a family heartbroken.
I think everybody in the royal family actually was really glad it happened in Scotland. And for Charles as well to be at Burke Hall, where it's such a kind of safe space for him, he feels very calm and relaxed, I think was very important. And that evening, he didn't have supper at Balmoral with the rest of the family. He and William went back to Burke Hall for the very serious work of prepping the next 10 days.
And I guess this was a real moment of realization for them. You know, Prince Charles is now King Charles III, Prince William now the Prince of Wales. And I guess this must have really been the moment when they thought to themselves, everything is changing.
Charles has thrown himself into his new role as king. But his biggest test of leadership is still to come. In an ever more expensive world where lots are struggling to make ends meet, the British monarchy has to make financial sense to survive.
It is important for King Charles III to be seen to be making the monarchy as economical as possible.
And personally, I think he has too many properties. I don't think it's a good look, and I rather think William might feel the same.
They can't just come across as these big, large landowners and living the life of royalty.
The pressure is on for King Charles to show he understands how normal people feel, and that he's doing what it takes to keep the crown on course. But what does that mean for his beloved Scottish lodge, nestled in the grounds of Balmoral?
How do you sell a property that is so close to one of the monarch's residences? You know, it's very close to the castle. Possibly it could be rented out on a rather exclusive basis. It's very hard to know what to do.
I don't think for one moment he'll sell it. I think he'll pass it down to another family member. I mean, presumably either William or possibly Harry.
Whatever happens, it's clear that Burke Hall is always going to have an important place in King Charles III's heart.
Charles was at Burke Hall when his mother died. He went back to Burke Hall after her funeral. He went to Burke Hall after his coronation, and when his divorce was finally finalised with Princess Diana, he went up to Burke Hall. It's obviously somewhere that to him is incredibly important.
It's a house that is sort of littered with royal history. The King's current connection with it, and what he will transfer to his children and his grandchildren, will be a good enough reason why Burke Hall will remain very much part of royal life.
I think that Burke Hall will long be associated with the House of Windsor.